context of this panel, Tim and I actually lived in Vietnam during the Asian crisis, and we saw how as soon as the economic collapse started, pressure on journalists really increased. When I lived in Hanoi, as soon as the Politburo realized they had a banking crisis, they made it illegal to write about banking. And obviously we haven't had such drastic measures in the United States, but it got me thinking about how does journalism function in times of crisis and during times of economic crisis. And this is not a subject that's been widely researched in academia, so I decided that it would be good for someone to put together a book. So I commissioned a series of chapters on this subject. And my husband, Joe Stiglitz, who many of you will know is Nobel laureate in economics and former Clinton economic advisor, wrote a chapter in the book, and he'll be talking about today some of his theories of information asymmetry and how it connects to this problem. Dean Starkman is the Kingsford Capital Fellow at Columbia Journalism Review, and he edits The Audit, which is their sort of business watchdog pages. And he wrote a chapter, he wrote a wonderful article in Mother Jones, which is included in this book. Chi-Chi Wu is a staff attorney at the National Consumer Law Center, and so she's been dealing a lot with press over the last few years and her advocacy work, and has some interesting insights into how the press has really changed during the recent crisis and the effects that staffing cuts and the budget cuts have had on our media, because we do think that the business models are actually very relevant to what's happening in terms of coverage. We're really pleased to have Vanessa Perry, who's an associate professor at George Washington University and an expert appointee at I hope I get this right, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And Vanessa's work is really important for those of us who are interested in the media, although it's not directly press related, because part of what Vanessa's been doing is analyzing messaging that comes to consumers through advertising. So this panel is, I think, a unique panel because it's not just sort of media critics and scholars, but also some people with advocacy and real-world experience. Dean has actually prepared a sort of special presentation, so just for this event.
I don't know how special.
Which I hope will appear in the book that he's writing. So I thought we would start with some of Dean's recent research, move to Joe, and then we'll have Chi-Chi and Vanessa. Probably each panelist will talk for 8 to 10 minutes, and then we can have discussion or answer some of your questions. Thank you very much. Can you hear me now? Okay, good. So Dean, let me hand you the microphone. And do let us know if you can't hear us. Thank you.
Handing the baton. Good morning. It's very nice to be here. And keeping in mind the sort of the framework for the panel, which was following the money, I thought about the media, where the media fits into this concept, of course, that's what the whole conference is about. Let me start with an anecdote. I was in the spring of 2009. I was invited to speak at a conference of a group called the Society of American Business Editors and Writers, and the panel was a bunch of very prominent people, including Larry Ingrassia, who's the business editor of the New York Times. Paul Steiger was the moderator. He was the Wall Street Journal's managing editor all during this period. I found it when I was sort of chagrined and intimidated to find that the title of the panel of these trade group of business writers was taken from a headline that I had written on a story of Mother Jones, which was, "How did 9,000 business reporters blow it?" And I was just finishing up this study of pre-crisis period, and what was interesting, I thought, was really, I give them credit for having me there and listening to my view, and I had just completed research on 8 years of business coverage and its weaknesses, a critical review. But what I thought was interesting at the end was everybody said, well, okay, different views about press performance, but what can we do now? And there was sort of a consensus on the panel that what we really need to do is hire more math PhDs. And I thought, because why? Because it's all so complicated, and it kind of fed into this idea that this is very opaque, and you had to be a flipping genius you know, a rocket scientist to be able to report about it. And I said, and I thought it wasn't, you know, wasn't a bad thought at the time, and for, you know, thinking on my feet, but I thought, I think you need more cop reporters, because that's the, you know, that's sort of the approach. And I actually had in mind a friend of mine who really, I mentioned him last night. He was a great, great financial journalist who had been a former cop reporter and was becoming one of our star financial investigators. His name was Mark Pittman, and to me, he was a Bloomberg reporter, and to me, his work was approaching the level of Gretchen Morgenson when he suffered an untimely death. A good pal of mine. It was strange at age 52, just bad health. Okay, so this was the sort of differences. This was sort of the perspective of the kind of business, of, you know, sort of the conventional thinking, I guess, of business writers. So with that in mind, I sort of thought about, okay, so what is it about business reporting? And why do we? I'm kind of assuming everyone here said, why? You know, they didn't do a good job, and they said, we did though. We did. You know, you just didn't read what we wrote, and so what is the disconnect? You know, you're right. You know, this is my business. I made it. So you're right. I mean, they really didn't provide necessary reporting. And so what I did was I went back and looked at coverage of a big bank, which I'm going to reveal later, but just to kind of build the suspense, by a alternative press and then the mainstream press. So this alternative examination was, and I'll give you the date later too, which is also significant. The alternative examination appeared in a periodical called Southern Exposure. I assume no one's ever, it's published by the Institute of Southern, or was. It's like one of these shaky things that comes and goes. Good for you, you subscribed. And it's published in Durham, and its focus is the South. That's why some of the language will be like weird, like why are they talking about the South? But it's not about the South per se. And so this reporter, his name's Mike Hudson, went and sort of examined this large financial institution, and he wrote an expose. It was an expose about subprime lending. And it's, you know, it's not great literature, but it's a very well written, very good, 6,000 word story about the lending practices of this, and it starts with the normal anecdote of somebody, you know, the branch manager of this institution calls and threatens to serve her with an arrest warrant because she's, you know, whatever. It's like, you know, the usual rough stuff. She's got a 17.9% mortgage at the time when interest rates were basically, you know, nothing. All sorts of things. And then the language goes on from there, and I'll just read a couple of really brief things. But there's is there an overlooked scandal brewing for, you know, X institution in places far from Wall Street? In southern hometowns such as Selma, Ashland, Kentucky, and Knoxville, Tennessee, people complain this bank has taken advantage of them in unglamorous parts of its financial empires. Personal loans and mortgages aimed at borrowers with bad credit, bills piling up, or in many instances simply a trusting nature. Unhappy customers claim the company manipulated them to paying excessive rates and hidden fees, refinancing at unfavorable terms, signing deals that trapped them into bankruptcy and foreclosure. The borrowers are part of the growing, quote, subprime market for financial services. They are mostly low-income, blue-collar, and minority customers snubbed by banks and credit card companies. Still others are middle-class consumers who have hit hard times because of layoffs and credit card-fueled overspending. Whatever the circumstances, they pay dearly, etc. And just to give you an idea of the scope of, you know, how he did this, was the 7-month investigation by Southern Exposure has uncovered a pattern of predatory practices within this bank's subprime units. Southern Exposure interviewed more than 150 people, borrowers, and this is kind of important, this list of who we talked to. Borrowers, attorneys, activists, current and ex-employees, especially the last one, and reviewed thousands of pages of loan contracts, lawyers, lawsuits, testimony, and company reports. The people in its documents provide strong evidence that this bank's subprime operations are reaping billions in ill-gotten gains by targeting the consumers who can least afford it. I'm going to And there's one stat that just kind of like boggles when you find out who the bank is. He goes, this bank has established itself as probably the most powerful player in the subprime market by swallowing competitors and employing its vast capital resources and its name brand respectability. This bank, its flagship subprime unit, claims 4.3 million customers and 16,000 plus branches in 48 states, including 350 offices across the South. Things don't stop with this unit, however. The web of subprime is woven throughout the bank. This executive's company has refashioned itself into a full-service subprime enterprise, one that makes high-cost loans and sells securities back to. In 2000, one study calculated nearly 3 of every 4 mortgages originated within this lending empire was made by its higher interest subprime affiliates. And there are 180,000 loans out of a total of 240,000. So check it out. The bank is Citigroup. And it's at the time the world's largest bank by some measures. This article was written, and it's like I can't even believe it. The summer of 2003. You know, so let's let that think in for a second. I have 2 minutes.
I might give you more.
And I only need 2 minutes because and this was a good story. It was not, but again, it wasn't rocket science, was it? It's the cop reporter thing. But if you contrast that really with what, it's lame to the lamestream, that name, but the major financial publications, mainstream media, it's covering. It's just a whole different view. I mean, they just do different things. They look at different things. They talk to different people, and in doing so, they missed it. They just missed it. Like a sample headline, which was very representative of Citigroup coverage during this time, was Business Week 2006. Rewiring Chuck Prince. Citi's chief hasn't just stepped out of Sandy Weil's shadow. He stepped out on his own as he strives to make himself into a leader with vision. And it's a good story, and the reporter's very good. I know her work very well, and it's like, it's not an uncritical piece. It just is interested. It's interested in other things, and it's talking to other people. And the last thing I'll do is just sort of run down a few other, the major stories that, and I think major stories are the ones that count, the ones that are on page 1 or covers of magazines are the ones that actually send the signals to, because what we're interested here is public awareness of. It's not investor awareness or people who are already cognoscenti about the financial system. It's about what the public learns. And so some of the sample headlines, I actually didn't get the site here, but Alone at the Top. I think that was a Fortune story. This is about Citi. This is Sandy Weil. That was August 2000. Whatever it takes. Sandy Weil has always rolled with the punches. Now he wants Citigroup to not only be the richest financial company, but also the purest in soul. Fortune 2002. Wall Street's toughest boss. Wall Street Journal, February 2003. People power. 2 financiers' careers trace a bank strategy that's now hot. Weil and Dimon, Jamie Dimon, now head of J.P. Morgan Chase, built a titan by focusing on consumers. Now there are rivals, a risk higher interest rates. The Wall Street Journal, 2004. This is actually quite accurate. Jamie Dimon, I can't remember what it was in 2004, like Bank One or something, or I can't remember. In any case, but they really were. It really was about consumers. I can't resist. If you read the Journal's piece, there's a line in there that kind of waves at the thing. There's this dual profile of Dimon and Weil, and in it, along the way, it says the trend has big risks for banks and their customers. The banking behemoths have gained a reputation for ingenuity at generating growth by tinkering with consumer interest rates and tacking on myriad fees. Period. Full stop. That's it. And then now back to our show. And the thing is, you can't call these stories uncritical or even uninteresting. They actually are interesting. But like I said, I critiqued this thing. I said this tinkering with rates and tech and a myriad of fees packs a lot of bad behavior into a very small space. And the thing is, et cetera. So that's sort of my whole thing. And the rest of it's like course correction behind Citigroup's departure as a culture shift by CEO Prince. You can really get it. Citi's new act, Chuck Prince, Citi Wild's top troubleshooters, unlikely choice, does he have the right stuff? Can Sally save Citi? Sally Krawcheck, CFO. If you read all those pieces, none of them are bad in any conventional journalistic sense, but they completely missed the entire issue. And I think this is a very well-informed crowd. I bet very few people know that Citigroup was actually a subprime leader during the period. Still, even today, don't know. So.
Is this mic working? Yes. Thank you, Dean. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that one of the important things that Dean is really highlighting is that there's a disconnect between the kinds of news that average people, mainstream America, consumers need, and what's actually being provided by the specialists. There's almost a built-in paradox, which is that the journalists who understand these subjects the best are places like the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times or the business pages of the New York Times, but their remit is really not to provide news for normal people, right? They're providing news for people in the business community and the investor community. And Dean and I have talked a lot about how the history of the business press actually dates back to newsletters with shipping prices in the 15th century in places like Venice and Antwerp. And so as Dean always says, sort of this mainstream reporting that's so necessary for sort of public discussion isn't really in the DNA of a lot of these institutions. So I think the information that people need will need to come from other sources. A lot of it will come from the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal. It's important to keep reading those, but they're not going to answer all the questions and address the concerns that regular people care about. There are, of course, exceptions. We have a chapter by Peter Goodman in our book, and he did a wonderful job of writing during the last crisis about the people that were losing their homes and their jobs. And as Dean says, Michael Hudson has been sort of toiling away on these subjects for really decades and getting attention, but not as much as he deserves. Before I move on to Joe, I'll just quickly say that we did a study last year where we analyzed 728 articles about the stimulus before it was passed and 3 months after and 6 months after. And what we found was sort of what Dean is saying. The coverage was not terrible at all, but it in no way set the agenda, led the discussion, or educated the public. You know, the vast majority of articles focused on the day-by-day spot news. Will it pass? Won't it pass? Who's going to vote for it? There were very few articles that actually explained the sort of economic implications and why it mattered. As you would expect, places like the Chicago Tribune, which of course had been against the New Deal, and the Wall Street Journal sort of announced the stimulus was a failure, you know, a week after it was passed. And then the only time, and some of them even said, you know, it's a failure before it had passed, and especially the columnists. And then 6 months later, when unemployment hadn't come down, that was when we suddenly saw all these articles about, you know, why stimuli don't work. So again, not terrible coverage. If you wanted to know the sort of nuts and bolts of day-to-day and where would the money go, sure, but not innovative or really forward-looking or not really adding that much to public understanding of macroeconomics. I'm sure that Joe has loads of things to say, so let me pass him the mic. Or hang on, you've got the mic?
Good. Look, I thought what I'd begin is talk a little bit about, begin a little bit more abstractly on the general problems of providing information, and then come a little bit more specifically to particular problems of this crisis. The distinctive aspect of information of the kind that Anya was mentioning is that economists call it a public good. Everybody benefits if there's good information, just like everybody benefits from a good government. But because everybody benefits, nobody has an incentive to supply it. So there is inevitably an undersupply of public goods. And so this, in a way, is the fundamental problem of getting a supply of disinterested, good information about our economy, about society, about anything. There are strong private incentives for distorted information. So there are strong incentives if you have a political agenda to get information out about why it is that the stimulus is not going to work, even if it's not true. Advertisers have an incentive to get out information about why, taking out a 30% interest rate mortgage is a good idea, and you'll enjoy it. You have a lot of private incentives for distorted information, but not enough incentives on the other side to get the kind of information that is essential for making society function. The particular business model, if you want to call it that we've used for the most part in the United States is you might call it an accidental model. It's one where information is supplied as a byproduct of advertising. So you deliver a newspaper, the model of the newspaper, for the most part, not all of them, but for the most part, newspapers survive economically by selling advertising. But people read the advertising in part because there are all these other news, but obviously with that business model, there's a problem. If you're supplying information and it's being financed by advertisers, you have to be a little bit tame to the advertisers. You have to be, say, sensitive to their concerns. So if one of your major advertisers are the banks, you're not likely to say that the banks are engaged in corruption and exploitation and all those things. And so, in a way, the basic business model of news delivery in the United States for a very long time was inherently biased. It's different in different countries. I mean, it is interesting that in some countries, the parties, each of the major political parties, have their own newspapers. That has its own problem, because then each of the newspapers is biased in their own way, but at least you get an array of biases. But nobody, and in that context, nobody really takes anything as truthful or honest. It's just what is the particular agenda that they're pursuing. There's another problem, though, for most media. They're competitive, but being competitive means that you succeed by access to stories. And who has the information? Well, typically, if you started thinking about who has the information, people usually who have the information have an incentive for you to tell their story in a particular way. So access to information that would allow you to break a story, to be on the forefront, requires a trade. Economists think that everything is involved exchange, and the particular exchange is they give you information in return for you giving them correct coverage. And so the way that news gets transmitted from those who have the information to the general public is almost inherently biased. I saw that very strongly when I was in Washington. I could tell when I read a story about, say, a cabinet meeting or something, who would leak the story. You could tell at first because if you read the story, you knew whose side they were explaining. We'd have some argument, and there would be alternative views, and one view would get predominance over another. They would try to give a balance, a little bit of balance. One story would be on the 14th page, and the other one would be on the first page. But they could then say, well, we gave both views. But then you start looking, if you follow this closely over time, you would then begin to understand that some reporters are owned by certain people in the administration. They wouldn't call it that, but that's really a more accurate description of what was going on. And this is true in most of the media, very true in the New York Times. I saw very, very clearly that there were certain reporters that you knew who they were talking to all the time, And then if you had any doubts about this, what we call exchange, you would see episodically a puff piece, we call them, glorifying the hero of the leaker. The guy who's giving the information would be described in one article or another as really the brains behind the administration, or the strong man in the administration, the guy who is the bringing on the ideas. So it was a very clear, it was not only that his ideas were being pushed, but his person was being pushed. So this is really an essential nature of the media. Now, in business journalism, it's even worse, because you're not going to get access to the business other than their press release if you don't treat them well. One episode, something in between, a story of a major agency, government. It doesn't claim to be an agency of the government, but it is, where the news reporter had reported basically their view of what they were doing, of the chairman's view of what they were doing, in a favorable light consistently. And then one day he wrote a story that was critical, and they gave a little bit of I think a fairly accurate depiction of some of the controversies and some of the darker side of what was going on. And 3 weeks later, he, rather than reporting these front page stories from Washington about what was going on in this important institution, he was reporting car sales in Detroit. He had basically been denied access. And once you denied access, you might as well be describing car sales in Detroit. So this is, I think, a fundamental problem when you have information that is essentially, even if it's supposed to be public, it's privatized. And therefore, you have an exchange of that private information to somebody else to make it public, but then you distort it. Well, in the crisis, this particular crisis, things were more coverage was to these problems I've just described. There was one more problem, which was the banks worked extraordinarily hard to make sure that no one knew what was going on. So they engaged in activities that were trying to make sure that the regulators, the investors, the shareholders didn't know what was going on. Because if they did know what was going on, they wouldn't be allowed. So with such active engagement in non-transparency, it's not surprising that it was very difficult for the media to uncover it, because, you know, as I say, it was not an accident that it was not transparent. What I found so amusing is some of the players, major players in this non-transparency, were those who had been critical of East Asia for being non-transparent. I suppose they were sensitive to the issue of non-transparency because they've been engaged in it, and they were worried that East Asia might be outdoing them, but there's absolutely no doubt who won that contest. American banks really outdid everybody in non-transparency. So that made it very difficult. And there were a few reporters, I'm glad that you mentioned Mark Pittman, because he was one of the reporters who really did the forensic accounting, you know, took the attitude that there's something funny going on here, used every tool, including the Freedom of Information Act. And some of the things, he died about a year ago, and it's so interesting, some of the Freedom of Information Act requests are just now coming out of things that he requested. It's taken a year, and we're still getting information from things that he requested. And it was so surprising to me is how few reporters were using the tools that they had on the Freedom of Information Act. I mean, I'll give you one example. The role of the Fed in the bailout of AIG and where the money went. Bernanke and Geithner did not want anybody to know. You know, they always are going to claim, like everybody in that context, state secret. You know, it will lead to the end of the world as we know it if people knew. But of course, we know why they don't want us to know, because it turned out that the largest recipient was Goldman Sachs of the AIG money, and the second largest recipient, and the third, I think maybe even the fourth, were foreign banks. And the notion that the U.S. Federal Reserve was using its money, effectively our taxpayer money, to bail out foreign banks might have had a political reaction. So the fact was that we now know why it was they didn't want us to know, and he was one of the few reporters that used the tools that we had to try to get at this. So finally, let me make two final comments about why in crises like this it's so difficult. And that is a combination of psychology and sociology. One of them is that when you have a bubble like the current one, everybody joins the herd, including the reporters. So they got taken up in the psychology of hysteria, of the bubble. And that's very difficult for reporters to separate themselves from society. They are part of society. So if everybody is believing that there's a bubble, it's very hard for them to stand back and say, no, there's not a bubble. And so one of the important roles of the press should always be one of a skeptic. And that's always difficult. And that's related to the second comment, more of a sociology and psychology, and that is everybody likes to be the cheerleader, to get the attention of being a cheerleader. And the famous story, the wonderful clips of CNBC or what of Maria Bartiromo. Yeah, you can feel the enthusiasm of the stock market going up, and somebody who think about the other side. If you're going to on one the writer or the newscaster wants people to listen. So think about what people want to listen to. Do people want to be told that they just made the worst mistake of their life in buying these things that are going to break? Or would they rather hear, boy, are you smart? And so there's a really natural tendency for the listeners to want to hear good news. They don't want to hear bad news. So if you present good news, you just told people who bought stock they're going to make a lot of money, they're going to listen to you. And if you have a market-based model of listeners, you're going to do better. And your boss is going to give you higher pay and going to give you more attention. So the market model really in this context has some really fundamental problems that even if journalists wanted to accurately describe what was going on, he might find himself without readers.
I think you've raised a couple of points that fit nicely with Chi-Chi Wu's talk that we're going to hear. Certainly, you're right that people don't want to hear bad news, and in the book we include some of the angry letters that were sent to journalists who wrote gloomy stories. A lot of people wrote right in and say, stop it, you're making things worse. You created a bubble, and now you're kicking the economy, and it's just not fair, and we're all going to suffer, and people will lose their jobs. So I think journalists, to be fair, often are afraid of inciting panic, and they know that if they say the stock market's in trouble, people will sell, and that will create more problems. So I think that fear is one thing. A feeling that you have to be responsible as a journalist and not create panic and fear. And I think that has really been aggravated in this last crisis by the fact that there's so many journalists have lost their jobs, thousands of positions have been cut, and there's fewer resources now, which may explain partly why Mark Pittman was the exception. The great reporters out there, Gretchen Morgensen, some of the other people, are stand alone. This has not been, the last few years has not been a time when journalists want to take risks or go against the conventional wisdom and the pack, because it's a time when you could lose your job. And I think that Chi-Chi has really been on the front line of some of these conversations because you work so closely with the media, and I know you've got some interesting thoughts on how that's evolved over the last couple of years.
Thank you, Anya. My name is Chi-Chi Wu. I'm with the National Consumer Law Center. Just to give you a little bit about who we are and what we do, we're a policy and advocacy group that works on consumer credit issues. I personally work on credit cards, credit reporting, and scoring, medical debt, and refund anticipation loans. I don't work on mortgage issues, but a lot of my colleagues do. And early in my career, I actually looked at mortgage documents and seen what was going on with the subprime market. Just a disclaimer, because I am a lawyer and a consumer advocate, we don't deal with individual cases. We can't provide individual advice. As I said, we're a policy advocacy. We provide technical assistance to other lawyers. So that's, in other words, please don't call with your personal consumer issues. I do work a lot with the press and the media in two ways. Proactively, when we issue a report or maybe write a set of regulatory comments, there's a rulemaking coming up and we want to publicize, getting the word out, we will, issue press releases, maybe even have a press conference. And then I often get calls unsolicited from the media looking for a quote, a perspective from a consumer advocate, or sometimes an answer to a technical question. Most of the reporters I talk to are actually not business or economic reporters. They are personal finance reporters, or they cover some sort of beat that is about maybe banking or financial services, but from a consumer perspective. Lately, I've been getting a lot of calls from websites and blogs that write articles about these issues, like creditcards.com. Occasionally, I talk to a local business reporter because something I'm working on has to do with a local company. For example, in refund anticipation loans, some of the prominent banks are from Louisville, Kentucky, so I'll get a call from the business reporter from the paper in Louisville. But in our planning call, I mentioned I've never talked once to the Financial Times. I have talked to the Wall Street Journal, but not the economics reporters. I talked to a couple of the reporters that work on consumer banking issues. And they are, the ones I do talk to do really good work. The overall issue is, and to use a word that was popular maybe in the last decade, is that some of these reporters are in silos. So you have reporters working on personal finance issues, and they want to know, what should you do if your interest rate on your credit card goes up? And the bigger picture issue of all the abuses in credit cards, or even a step above that, not connecting to economic reporters, the fact that credit card debt is responsible for a lot of the subprime mortgages. No, it's not investors, buying houses in Las Vegas and flipping houses that caused the subprime crisis and the meltdown. It's people who got into credit card debt that got walloped by huge retroactive rate increases and couldn't handle it, and then pulled equity out of their houses. In the meantime, that equity got stripped through fees and high interest rates. That caused the problem. And so the siloization of reporters between different beats, and they're not connecting, leads to a disconnect and also an inability to see the big picture. And to be fair, it's not their job to do that. Their job is to write about what they're assigned to write about. And some of them did go above and beyond simply covering, nuts and bolts and looked at the bigger picture. And, there are some folks out there who did really excellent work. And you know, there's one reporter from USA Today, Kathy Chu, who I think probably was one of the factors that we had credit card reform in 2009. So you know, there are reporters who try to break out of that. I think that is really heroic. Another exception in terms of business reporters, I do talk to the trade press. American Banker in particular does call us. And it's funny, Dean, that you should mention the Society of American Business Editors and Writers, because I wanted to give you guys this quote, entirely self-congratulating and as a plug for our organization, but one of the winners of an award from the Society of American Business Editors and Writers, who works for American Bankers, gave this tip at the, I guess, the award ceremony, that he said the story he won an award for came about after a conversation with an attorney from the National Consumer Law Center, not me, which tends to be critical of the bankers and regulators who comprise American Bankers' regular readership. Making a few open-ended calls a week to industry skeptics and consumer advocates has been really helpful to me. The best ones know about much about ground-level industry practices as bank officials themselves do, Jeff says. And they rarely get asked about technical stuff by the general interest publications that call them for quotes. So, you know, here's a new thought. Why don't you call industry skeptics and consumer advocates once in a while? Now, by the way, if you are a reporter, don't call me, call Jan Kruse, K-R-U-S-E. She's our communications director. She just started about a month ago. If you call me about a mortgage issue, I will know nothing. So call Jan Kruse. But yes, we actually have a communications director, and we do talk to the media. Now, you know, I want to be fair. It is a lot to ask. You know, breaking through silos, checking in regularly with consumer advocates. You know, we're talking about an industry that, as Anya said, is shrinking, is losing resources. There are fewer reporters to cover issues in depth and to get a deep understanding of problems. And we're losing some of them. You know, Kathy Chu, who I mentioned, she still works for USA Today, but she's in Asia covering Asian economic issues now. And so Mike Hudson, big fan of Mike Hudson's work, but he actually now works for the Center for Responsible Lending.
Changed job. He's at the Center for Public Integrity, right? But you're right.
Yeah, so he's no longer doing reporting for a mainstream publication. He's actually working for one of us, the nonprofits. So, you know, it's getting worse to the point where, you know, I've been doing this about 10 years, and I've observed that when I first started, if I put out a press release, you know, in a press release, you're supposed to write some quotes. And I was always like, why am I writing quotes? Because they never get picked up. What happens is a reporter calls me and has a conversation and takes a quote. Lately, that's not been true. Reporters have been just lifting quotes out of the press release. I'm actually astounded. And so the same quote will show up over and over again. And it's not because it's syndicated. It's different reporters. That almost never used to happen. Now, you know, for me, that might be a positive because our message is getting out there and I don't have to spend the 20 minutes or whatever with the reporter. But obviously, that's bad for journalism and bad for people who want to make social change because they're doing that with the other side, too. And what that means is information and quotes and perspectives are being picked up uncritically. The positions are not being examined. An example of that from a couple of years ago was there was this argument that the Community Reinvestment Act was responsible for the subprime mortgage crisis, that loans to low-income people and minorities were responsible for everything, and if the government hadn't forced these banks to make CRA loans, everything would have been okay. Completely false. I mean, completely false. The CRA has been around for decades and before the subprime mortgage crisis. You know, the lenders that were making these loans many of them weren't even covered by the CRA. But, you know, this argument got picked up and replayed without criticism because some of the reporters didn't have a deeper understanding. I mean, it would be like, I mean, I know you're supposed, journalists are supposed to, give one side and give another, but if one of the sides is so incredulous, you got to examine it, and that wasn't what was happening. I mean, just to give you an analogy, if we were talking about the moon, and one side was talking about the mineral composition in the moon, and the other side said, no, the moon is made out of cheese. You would want to examine that as a reporter, right? because you know the moon isn't really not made out of cheese. So, I mean, I do want to end, though, on a positive note. That, you know, we've been talking today that there are reporters that are doing good work. They're breaking out of silos. They're doing in-depth examinations and trying to get the big picture. And, you know, some of them are still around. And, you know, with the advent of the internet and free access to articles, that means they are being more widely distributed. Now, this, of course, is what led to the problems with journalism and newspapers losing revenue, but it also means that many more members of the public have access to the good reporting, that it is accessible to everyone, or at least it will be until all these paywalls go up. So, you know, there is good news, and you know, the fact that journalists like Mike Hudson are going to the Center for Public Integrity, that you do have nonprofits now starting to do this kind of beat cop reporting is also positive. You know, the ProPublicas of the world, and that, you know, everybody can access their information. It no longer depends on your local newspaper bringing something to you. So, you know, there is a small group of people doing good work, and you know, as any good progressive, we're all familiar with my favorite quote about never doubting that a small group, and I'm getting this wrong, okay, the small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world.
Thank you, Chi-Chi. So Dr. Perry will, I think you have a PowerPoint prepared, is that right?
Oh, no,
Professor?
no.
Okay, so that's great. that academic instinct.
You know.
And before Professor Perry starts, just want to remind, can everyone hear me, that they're collecting cards. So if you have questions, we will have time for a few questions. So hand them to Tim, please. Thank you, Doctor.
Oh, great. Great to be here. Great not to be in class teaching, talking to real people today. When I'd like to talk, not that students aren't real people, they pay real tuition, but be that as it may, I'd like to make a couple of comments about advertising, which Joe actually talked about explicitly and others alluded to before and during the current economic crisis. First, I've got to say this, as an employee of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, my comments are my own, my views are my own, and they do not reflect those of the Bureau, Department of the Treasury, Elizabeth Warren, the administration, or anyone else of importance. It's just me. So I also want to mention that some of the research I'm going to present, and I'm just going to give you a few of the highlights, is summarized in an article in California Management Review in 2009 with my co-author Carol Motley. And what we've been looking at, again, we started out looking at advertising leading up to the subprime mortgage crisis. And in the process of gathering and analyzing the data, things changed so rapidly that the study kept evolving and evolving. But we learned a few interesting things. Now, let me back up. We all like to think that we are not influenced by advertising. And a lot of people in the advertising industry believe that it's not really very influential anymore, and so they've kind of shifted resources to non-traditional ways of reaching out to consumers. Well, and that's probably true. But what's also true is that in order to really screen out a message, you've got to listen to it. You know, you really have to sort of figure out who's saying what in order to determine whether or not you're going to pay any further attention to it. And at that point, the process of influence has already begun. Because what happens is we're all subject to these kind of truth effects, which means that unless we feel very, very passionately against something, the more we hear the same theme, the same message, the more likely we are to believe it over time. Also, through this process of repetition, there are these sleeper effects. So we may have initially heard something crazy, like the moon is made of cheese, and I say, okay, well, that sounds crazy. Chi-Chi must be crazy for telling me something so preposterous. But if I keep hearing the moon is made of cheese over time, I'll remember that and forget that it was actually Chi-Chi who told me. So what happens is I start to believe the message because I can't remember why it was initially so incredible. So what happens with advertising messages is taken as a whole. They actually have this influence on us as a backdrop, as a sort of context for our decision making, which turns out to be very persuasive. And this is the kind of situation that consumers found themselves in starting at the early stages of this crisis, leading up to this crisis, and still currently to this day. One of the key things that we found when we analyzed, the TV, radio, print, internet, billboard advertising about mortgages over a 4-year period is that there is just a rip-roaring lack of factual information. There is almost nothing of value, but there are these themes that people carry with them. So with that, I'm just going to show some examples because, as they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words, but no PowerPoint. Let's see if this works. This is one of my favorite of all time. What's it telling me?
Someday, your own hot tub. Today, a Wells Fargo home equity account can help you make the most of your home. Get started on your someday today at Wells Fargo. Someday, your own hot tub. Today, a Wells Fargo home equity account can help you make the most of your home. Get started on your someday today at Wells Fargo.
You've got to see the beginning of this.
This is nice.
Someday, your own hot tub.
Okay.
Today,
I told you, you had to see that. It's my favorite because it really does say a lot about this so-called American dream that we were all supposedly seeking that led up to this. This one's interesting because it shows how advertisers are sort of using the news, if you will, news-like formats. This is not working.
More good news as a result of the government bailout plan. Interest rates continue to drop to their lowest levels in years. This is great news for homeowners and future home buyers.
The government's massive bailout plan provides the most significant boost to help homeowners since the Great Depression.
Lend America, one of the nation's leading FHA lenders, announces a bombshell, multi-million-dollar commitment for homeowners to refinance.
Lend America is making home loans available immediately to refinance up to 97.75% of a home's value. Borrowers are not subject to a minimum credit score to qualify and can close in as little as 10 days. Homeowners are urged to call the hotline on the screen to reserve their share of Lend America's multi-million-dollar offer.
Apply right over the phone to reduce monthly payments, pay off adjustable rate loans, consolidate debt into one low monthly payment, or take cash out for any reason. Call Lend America right now. Hundreds of mortgage specialists are standing by.
Are probably familiar with Lend America. This was the fraudulent lender that stole millions of dollars from home buyers via FHA refinance mortgages. And I believe that both the president and CEO have been indicted now for wire fraud and related kinds of infractions. But the interesting thing about this ad is the fact that they use this sort of CNN-like format. And so for a consumer who's not really paying close attention they might actually mistake that for actual news coverage. All right, try another one. All right. Oh, shoot.
Zero to 60 in 4.2 seconds.
Yo. Yeah, I'm working on your home loan right now. Fees? Let me check your file.
How much for the gold package? 10,000.
10,000? Yeah? Ciao.
If your mortgage broker is living large off of your dollar, then it's time to stop this man. Advantix Lending offers no closing costs for homeowners with bad credit. No points, no fees. Advantix Lending. Put the money in your pocket, not the broker's.
Okay, admittedly, that's a pretty cheesy ad, but I think the theme is very interesting, and that is one of mistrust. Do not trust these lenders. Now, what's interesting is like, okay, don't trust the lenders, trust the lender that's got this cheesy ad on. I'm not sure about that, but the theme of mistrust is very prevalent. Even when it and is even used, because here's a similar one, by more credible sources. Let's see if we can make this work. This is great.
Welcome. I understand you need a little help with your mortgage. Want to avoid foreclosure. Smart move. Candy? Well, you're in luck. We're experts in this sort of thing. Mortgage, rigmarole, whatnot.
Really?
Absolutely. And we guarantee results, for a small fee, of course. Such are the benefits of having a professional on your side. Why don't we get a contract? Who wants a contract?
Here you go, Pete.
Thanks, Betty.
Write a toner.
Sign it. Come on, sign it. Families around the country, every single day, saving homes.
We will talk it over with.
If you're facing foreclosure, make sure you're talking to the right people. Speak with HUD-approved housing counselors free of charge at 888-995-HOPE.
Actually, that's someone that NeighborWorks can be trusted, but their message was essentially the same theme as the previous. All right, I think I've got one further example for you. And there's the Tearjerker Approach. What's interesting about these is that, fear appeals have been widely used in advertising forever, and we know that negative information tends to carry more weight in decision making, so it can be an effective way to get people to really pay attention. But if the message is too fearful, it actually causes people to go into this sort of emotional decision-making mode. They're less likely to collect the information they need to make an informed decision. Let's see if I can get this to go.
After my divorce, and I got this place, and I was just so happy that I could get something by myself, me and my girls. After the refinancing and my payment went up, I couldn't do it anymore.
I felt really sad, and it was our home, and I didn't want to move because I thought we were going to be there for a long time.
I just felt like such a failure to my kids.
Foreclosure is the single worst hit to your credit out there, worse than bankruptcy. It's going to follow you for 10 years.
And then I didn't know what was going to happen to me after that, if I was going to be sued and live, end up being homeless.
It was really stressful, and every day she'd come home and she'd cry.
It just wasn't supposed to turn out this way. It was hard. It was really hard. I had never heard of short sales either. I just thought I didn't have a choice but to walk away.
A short sale is when we have an offer to purchase on a home that is less than the mortgage amount. The lenders actually come out better because there are statistics that show that if a lender has a home go into foreclosure, they lose about 30 to 50% more than if it was a short sale.
She got me out of a financial crisis.
There is no better feeling than actually walking onto a closing table for a short sale.
It was a huge relief when I left there that day after closing. I was heartbroken, but it was a huge relief that it was over. I would recommend it to anybody to go with a short sale, not a foreclosure, because you don't have to. I am very relieved now. Financially, I can breathe.
Everybody pull out your iPhones and Blackberries and call RE/MAX right now. So who knows whether that's who you should turn to if you find yourself in trouble. Myself, I would call NeighborWorks, but you know, who knows? Again, taken individually, nobody would necessarily pay any particular attention to any of these, but taken as a whole, it paints this picture of this kind of despair, if you will, but it doesn't point people to factual information that can actually help them. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up, but I think the key point is that, you know, regulators are not going to tell advertisers what they can and cannot say beyond things that are, you know, absolutely misleading. So it's really important to try to provide some balance, some other messages perhaps that can offset these, and I think that might be an effective way to improve the conditions in the informational environment. Thank you.
Maybe you want to choose one of these questions to answer in the question and answer period. Okay. I want to make sure every panelist answers a question. I don't know if any of the panelists wanted to comment on that presentation by Dr. Perry. That was amazing. That was really just propaganda, wasn't it? I don't know, Dean or Chi-Chi, do you have any thoughts?
Only what Joe would have to say about informational asymmetries.
No, just to echo, it is true. I mean, you know, I do work with attorneys who work with clients, and they'll say, yeah, I should be able to do X, Y, Z because I saw it in a late night ad. They really sometimes can't tell the difference between the advertising and the news. And, you know, I do think maybe that there should be sort of more aggressive pushing of enforcement as to when something is not outright deceptive, but pretty misleading, because that is, you know, the standard under the law, that, you know, misleading advertising is supposed to be prohibited too.
It was so interesting when we were preparing for the panel. One of the things it turned out that all the panelists agreed on is one of the pet peeves is this idea that, you know, we just need more financial literacy among consumers. And the point was made by a number of panelists that a lot of what went on was criminal, and it was deception, and it was a con, and the idea that it was the consumer's fault for not being more literate and educated really annoyed a lot of us.
That's one of my biggest pet peeves. Yeah. It's basically blaming the victim.
Yeah, but these are very powerful propaganda messages. So there's a lot of fantastic questions. I would say about 90% were economic questions addressed to my husband and not about the media. And in the interest of fairness and staying on topic, I want to make sure that all the panelists get to answer a question. So I will take the, I was going to begin, if that's okay. The first one were sort of economics questions for Joe, and then there were a few about alternative business models and how we can solve some of these problems. Where do we get our news? And the question of how people get information. So I just wanted to talk for a couple of minutes about some of the research we've been doing and some sort of examples from around the world. And then I guess we'll go down, and I don't know if we should say Joe for last, because he has the most questions to answer. I don't know how many of you know Marcus Pryor's work on broadcast democracy. It's actually quite interesting. It turns out that, you know, everyone's always wondering, has the internet made us stupider or smarter, and has it made us more polarized or less polarized? And it turns out that a lot of things are happening at the same time. In the olden days, when there was just television, you had 3 channels, you had really no choice. So it turned out that lots of people who just had the TV on ended up absorbing lots more news than today, just because there was nothing else to watch. So a lot of those, that's not happening anymore. Now with the internet and so many cable channels, people have a choice to turn away from news if they want to. So certain segments of the population are getting less news and less sort of quality journalism than they were before. On the other hand, people that are really interested in a subject are now able to find many more sources of information than they could before. So I hope that answers one of the questions about sort of what kinds of information people are getting and how. Some of the websites that we really like on this panel are Naked Capitalism, CreditWriteDowns.com, obviously places like for international news, Global Voices, Global Post. So there are lots of sites and ways to get news now that there weren't before. In terms of business models, the US model traditionally, as Dean alluded to, has been largely advertising based. In the US, it's about 70% advertising, 30% subscriber. In the OECD, it's closer to 50-50, half subscriber, half advertising. The research that's been done has found there's sort of pros and cons for both. For example, in most of Africa, there's very little advertising revenue. It's mostly subscription or circulation based. And some research suggests that when you have a heavy reliance on circulation, the quality of news becomes more sort of commercial and tabloidish, because that's actually what people want. And there are some economists who've looked at the question of sort of ideology versus spin. So when you have, you know, one newspaper, one TV station owned by the government, it's very heavy on ideology. When you have a totally free market with lots of competition, you end up with a lot of sort of spin. And also, I read one study, I don't think it's necessarily the be-all and end-all, which suggests that when you have more competition, you sometimes get lower quality media, in fact. Which is a very strange idea, I know. We've been looking at Columbia. Don't ask me how, but I got involved in advising the government of Bhutan on how to support their media. And it's been so much fun with my students for the last couple of years, because we've been looking all around the world at different models. And it's so clear there are loads of options. I mean, I feel embarrassed to even discuss them in a room where Bob McChesney's standing, because clearly he is really the person who's been writing about this for years, and his new collection of essays, which I just read last weekend, is superb. But again, you probably know more about this than I do, but just to cover some of the ranges, you've got everything from, you know, the old sort of communist Soviet Union China model, where the government organizations bought subscriptions and therefore supported media that way. In the US now, we have a lot more foundation activity. In the US, mostly there's been so much resistance to sort of government support and government subsidies. Thank you. But so some organizations are going for the 501c3 model of becoming a nonprofit, getting foundation money. I know you all know like Voices of San Diego and some of the small local news sites. There are also sites where people can chip in and pay for stories they want to see covered. So that's some of what's happening in the US. But those are sort of small, local, decentralized initiatives. In Europe, you have things, yeah, I know we have 15 minutes left. Everything from Sweden, for example, supports media and their goal is diversity of voices. So they support the second largest paper in every market. Not the first largest, but the second largest, to make sure there's always diversity. Canada has laws about local content, which partly came as a way of making sure they weren't flooded by US media outlets. But around the world, there's, again, just a huge range. There's everything from government advertising, which is often a disaster because it can lead to undue influence, but sometimes works, again, in places like Canada. It was a big mess in Australia and Argentina. There are trusts like the BBC, The Guardian, the BBC, which is funded by license fees. So there's a range of options around the world. And I think what's happened in the US is that people haven't yet yet been willing to consider them. I don't know that anyone's answered, how do you fund, it's easy to fund a small nonprofit with a local news outlet with some foundation money, but how do you actually subsidize something like the New York Times while still retaining editorial independence, and where's the money going to come from? So there's a range of options, but many of them haven't yet really been discussed seriously in this country. I don't know, Vanessa Chichi-Dean, if you wanted to answer any of your questions, and then we can let Joe do a big fat roundup of 25 economic questions. I don't know who wants to go first. We have 15 minutes to answer our 40 questions.
I have a good question. I'll answer it really quickly because I'd love to hear from Joe, actually, but this is a good one. So Joe S. pointed out that banks are non-transparent, but Dean S. pointed out that Southern uncovered Citicorp's practices in 2003. So the info was there for reporters to look. Isn't the problem that too many reporters, only reporters tell them, et cetera? I think a really fair question. The way I think about the whole mortgage crisis is I divide it into two big chunks. There's the mortgage market, and then there's the aftermarket. The mortgage market is the one that Hudson was covering. This was the stuff that you could get on the ground. This is the things you can get from borrowers, plaintiff lawyers, regulators, and very crucially, ex-employees who were whistleblowers. That's who Hudson talked to. The aftermarket, I agree with Joe. So much of that stuff was off the balance sheet in things that we had never heard of as journalists. What are they called, Joe? SIVs, special investment vehicles? I mean, Citigroup had $48 billion in subprime garbage off its balance sheet. So there was an incredible opacity in the aftermarket, and I think if you're going to make fair judgments, you really have to distinguish between those two. So that's how I'd answer that.
So one of the questions that I got was, so please talk about the coverage or lack of regarding Vice President Biden's link to MBNA in Delaware. Just a little bit of context. There are 2 states where most of the big banks are chartered, Delaware and South